Don't touch it, someone had told her once. Some creatures are meant to die alone. But when the massive black wolf collapsed into the snow just 10 feet in front of Elena Whitmore, breath shallow and body trembling under the pale glow of the moon, she knew she wasn't walking away. The cold bit through her thin sleeves as she stood frozen for half a second too long, heart pounding loud enough to drown out the distant sounds of laughter from the packed ceremony behind her, the place she had just been forced to leave, the place where she didn't belong. Elena swallowed, her fingers curling into fists before slowly releasing as she took one careful step forward, then another, boots crunching softly over the frost-covered ground, her breath visible in the sharp night air. The wolf was enormous, larger than anything she had ever seen, its dark fur matted and uneven, its chest rising and falling with uneven effort, and there was something about the way it lay there, still, silent, but not broken, that made her chest tighten. This wasn't just an animal. She could feel it, deep in her bones, in that quiet, overlooked part of herself everyone said was useless. "Hey, it's okay," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath, though she knew it couldn't understand her words, only the tone, the intention. The wolf's ear twitched, just slightly, and that was enough to pull her the rest of the way in. She dropped to her knees beside it, ignoring the cold seeping instantly through the fabric of her skirt, her hands hovering uncertainly for a moment before she forced herself to act, to do something instead of nothing. "You're not dying tonight," she murmured, more to steady herself than to promise anything real, and then she began. Her fingers trembled as she pressed gently against its side, feeling the heat beneath its fur, the uneven rhythm of its breathing, and when she found the source of the injury, she sucked in a quiet breath, her heart twisting at the sight. It was bad. Worse than anything she had ever handled. For a second, fear clawed up her throat, whispering that she should leave, that this wasn't her responsibility, that if anyone found her here, alone with a creature like this, they would blame her, punish her, remind her exactly where she stood in the hierarchy she had never been allowed to forget. But the wolf shifted slightly, a low, almost imperceptible sound escaping it, and that was enough. Elena exhaled slowly, grounding herself, then reached for the hem of her dress and tore a strip of fabric free with a sharp pull, the sound loud in the silence of the forest. "Stay with me," she said softly, pressing the cloth into place with steady hands that no longer shook, her focus narrowing until the world shrank to just this moment, this breath, this fragile line between life and loss. Time blurred after that, measured only in the rhythm of her movements and the quiet rise and fall beneath her hands, until the distant horizon began to soften, the first hint of dawn creeping into the sky. Elena didn't notice right away. She only realized when the air shifted, when the silence changed, when something deep and instinctive told her she wasn't alone anymore. Her hands stilled. Slowly, carefully, she looked up, and the wolf was gone. Elena's breath caught somewhere between her chest and her throat as the empty space in front of her refused to make sense, her hands still hovering in the air where warm fur had been only seconds ago, her fingers slowly curling as the cold rushed back in to replace it, sharp and real and grounding in a way that made her pulse spike instead of calm. She blinked once, then again, her gaze sweeping the snow, searching for tracks, for movement, for anything that could explain how something that large could simply vanish without a sound. But the ground told no story, the frost untouched except for her own knees pressed into it, her own footprints leading in and out like she had imagined everything, like exhaustion and loneliness had finally caught up with her. "No, that is not possible," she whispered, her voice barely steady, shaking her head as she pushed herself up, her legs stiff from the cold and the hours she had not noticed passing, her eyes scanning the tree line now, the dark silhouettes stretching long in the early light, the forest holding its breath as if it were watching her instead of the other way around. A faint sound broke the stillness behind her, not loud, not threatening, just the soft shift of weight against frozen ground. But it was enough to send a chill racing up her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature, her body going still before she could stop it, instincts she never trusted suddenly awake and sharp. She turned slowly, carefully, her heart pounding so hard she was sure whoever stood there could hear it. and for a moment her mind refused to connect what her eyes were seeing. Where the wolf had been, where blood had stained the snow, there now stood a man, tall and unmoving, as if he had been carved from the same quiet strength that filled the forest, his presence heavy in a way that pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe. His dark hair fell loosely around his face, still damp from the melting frost, his shoulders broad and steady. And there was something in the way he held himself, completely still yet completely aware, that made every instinct in her body scream a warning she could not ignore. Elena took a step back without meaning to, her boots sliding slightly against the icy ground, her hands instinctively lifting as if that would somehow protect her from whatever this was, her voice catching before she forced it out. "Who are you?" The question sounded small even to her own ears, swallowed by the space between them. But his eyes found hers instantly, sharp and unwavering. And the moment that connection locked into place, something inside her shifted, something deep and unfamiliar that made her breath hitch. His gaze was not confused, not startled, not even curious. It was knowing, intense in a way that felt like he was seeing more than just her face, more than the worn fabric of her clothes or the way her hands still trembled from the cold, as if he could see the choice she had made hours ago, the moment she had knelt beside something everyone else would have abandoned. He took one step toward her, slow and deliberate, and the air seemed to tighten around them, every sound in the forest fading until all she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat and the quiet, controlled breath he drew in, as if testing the air itself. Elena's pulse raced, her mind scrambling for something logical, something safe. But nothing about this felt safe. Nothing about him felt ordinary. And yet he did not move like a threat, did not close the distance in a way that forced her to run. Instead, he stopped just a few feet away, close enough that she could see the faint lines of strain still lingering in his expression, close enough to notice the exact place where she had pressed the fabric against his side, now healed in a way that should not have been possible. Her breath caught again, realization creeping in slowly, unwillingly, as her gaze flickered from his face to where the wound had been and back again, her voice barely more than a whisper now. "You were the wolf." It was not a question, not really, but saying it out loud made it real in a way she was not ready for. And for a long second, he said nothing, his eyes holding hers, weighing, measuring, before something in his expression shifted just enough to change everything. His voice, when it finally came low and steady, carrying a weight she could feel rather than just hear. "You stayed." Two simple words, but they landed like something far heavier, something that made her chest tighten without understanding why. And suddenly the cold did not feel as sharp anymore, because something else had taken its place, something deeper, something that told her this moment was not an accident, and whatever stood in front of her now was not just a man she had saved, but someone who could change everything she thought she knew. The words settled between them, quiet but unshakable, and Elena felt them linger in her chest longer than they should have, her breath unsteady as she searched his face for something familiar, something human she could understand. But there was nothing simple about the way he looked at her, nothing easy in the way his presence filled the space around them. She swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze even as every instinct told her to step back again, to put distance between herself and whatever force stood in front of her now. But her feet refused to move, rooted in place by something she could not explain. "I did not know what you were," she said finally, her voice softer than she intended but steady enough to carry, her fingers curling slightly at her sides as if remembering the warmth of his fur beneath her hands, the weight of his breathing, the fragile line she had held him on through the night. His expression shifted again, not softer, not exactly, but something in his eyes deepened, like recognition settling into place rather than surprise. And when he spoke, his voice was lower now, more grounded, as if each word carried intention instead of curiosity. "Most would not have stayed long enough to find out," he said, and there was no accusation in it, no judgment, only a quiet statement that made her chest tighten in a way she did not expect. Elena let out a slow breath she had not realized she was holding, her gaze dropping briefly to the snow between them before lifting again, drawn back by something stronger than her fear, something that felt almost like understanding even though she knew nothing about him. "They would have left you," she said, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. And for a moment, something unreadable flickered across his face, gone as quickly as it came, but leaving behind a trace of something heavier, something that made the silence between them feel different, less empty and more charged. Before she could question it, the forest shifted again, this time not subtle, not quiet, but alive with distant movement, the faint echo of voices carrying through the trees, sharp and purposeful. And Elena's body reacted instantly, her head turning toward the sound, her pulse spiking as recognition hit. They were searching, not for her, but for him. Her eyes snapped back to his, urgency replacing uncertainty. "You need to go," she said quickly, the words coming faster now, her voice low but firm as she took a small step back, creating space where none had existed before. "If they find you here, they will not stop," she added, not thinking about what he was, only what she knew of the people behind her, the ones who feared what they did not understand. For a second, he did not move, his gaze still locked on hers as if weighing something she could not see, something beyond the approaching voices, beyond the danger closing in, and it made her frustration rise unexpectedly, her hands lifting slightly as if to push him away even though she knew she could not. "Did you hear me?" she pressed, her voice sharper now, fear threading through it despite her effort to stay calm. "You have to leave." The corner of his mouth shifted just slightly, not quite a smile, not quite anything she could name. And then he took a step closer. Instead of back, closing the distance she had tried to create, his presence pressing in around her again, steady and unyielding, and her breath caught as her instincts flared, warning and awareness tangled together in a way that made it impossible to think clearly. "They are not looking for me," he said, his tone calm, certain, as if the approaching danger meant nothing to him, as if it could not reach him where he stood. And that confidence should have reassured her, should have made her feel safe. But instead it unsettled her more, because it meant he knew something she did not, something she could not see yet. Elena's heart pounded harder, her gaze flickering past him toward the trees again. The voices closer now, clearer, and then back to him, searching, questioning, trying to understand why he was not afraid, why he was still here when every part of her was telling her to run. And then he said it, quiet but undeniable. "They are looking for the wolf." And something in the way he said it made the truth settle fully into place, not just in her mind, but in her chest, heavy and real, because he was not just the wolf she had saved, not just a stranger standing in its place. He was something far more dangerous, far more powerful, and somehow, impossibly, he was choosing to stay exactly where she stood. Elena felt the truth of his words settle into her like a weight she could not shift, her pulse racing as the distant voices grew sharper, closer, the unmistakable sound of boots against frozen ground breaking through the fragile stillness that had surrounded them only moments ago, and every instinct inside her screamed that standing here, exposed in the open, was a mistake she could not afford. "Then you cannot be here when they arrive," she said quickly, her voice tight with urgency now as she glanced toward the trees again, measuring distance without meaning to, calculating how long they had before the forest gave them away, before someone stepped into the clearing and saw exactly what she was standing beside. When she turned back to him, he had not moved, not even a fraction, his attention still fixed entirely on her, as if the approaching danger did not exist, as if she were the only thing that mattered in this moment. And that realization unsettled her more than anything else. "Why are you still here?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, frustration and fear threading together in her tone, because none of this made sense. Not his calm, not his certainty, not the way he stood there like the world could shift around him and he would remain exactly where he chose to be. For a brief second, something almost unreadable crossed his expression, something quieter, deeper, before his gaze softened just enough to change the air between them again, his voice lowering as he answered. "Because you are," he said simply, and the words hit harder than she expected, simple but unyielding, like a truth he had already accepted long before she could understand it. Elena's breath caught, her thoughts stalling as that answer echoed in her mind. But there was no time to process it, no space to question what it meant, because the forest was no longer silent, branches shifting, voices calling out directions, their presence now undeniable and dangerously close. You do not understand, she said, stepping closer without realizing it, her hand lifting slightly, as if she could physically push him away from the clearing, from her, from this entire moment. If they see you, they will not care what you are, they will only see something they fear. And they will react before they think, she added, her voice dropping as the weight of her own experience pressed into her words. The memory of how quickly judgment formed, how easily it turned into action. His gaze followed the movement of her hand, not dismissing it, not ignoring it, but acknowledging it in a way that made her hesitate, as if he understood more than she was saying, more than she could put into words. Then, without warning, he reached out, his hand closing gently but firmly around her wrist, stopping her movement before it could become distance again, and the contact sent a sharp, unexpected warmth up her arm that made her breath hitch, her eyes snapping to his face as her body went still. It was not forceful, not threatening, but it was undeniable, grounding in a way that pulled her attention completely back to him, away from the approaching voices, away from the fear that had been building. Elena, he said, her name steady on his lips as if he had always known it, as if it belonged there, and the sound of it in his voice made something in her chest tighten in a way she did not understand. She did not remember telling him, did not remember offering that piece of herself, and yet he spoke it with certainty, like it had always been his to say. Her pulse quickened again, confusion layering over everything else as she tried to pull her hand back, not out of fear but out of the sudden awareness of how close they were, how easily he had closed the space between them. But his hold did not tighten, did not trap her. It simply remained, steady and present, until she stilled on her own. The voices broke through the trees then, closer than before. Shadows beginning to form between the trunks as figures moved just beyond the edge of the clearing. And Elena's heart jumped into her throat, her gaze darting toward them and back again, panic rising despite her efforts to stay calm. Please, she said, the word quieter now, more urgent than before as she met his eyes again. You need to trust me and go. And for the first time since he had appeared, something in his expression shifted in response to her. Not uncertainty, not fear, but something that looked almost like consideration, as if he were weighing her words against something far greater, something only he could see, and the space between them held for a fraction of a second longer before everything changed. The moment stretched thin, fragile as frost beneath her feet, and Elena felt it. In the way his grip remained steady on her wrist, not tightening, not releasing, as if the decision hanging between them was balanced on something neither of them could fully control. The shadows at the edge of the clearing shifted again, clearer now, voices cutting through the trees with sharper direction, and she knew they had seconds, not minutes. Please, she whispered again, her voice breaking just slightly under the weight of urgency, her eyes searching his for any sign that he understood what was coming. What would happen if he stayed? What would happen to her if she was found with him? His gaze did not waver, did not soften in fear, but something in it changed, something quieter, more deliberate, as if he had reached a conclusion she had not been part of. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his fingers loosened around her wrist, the warmth of his touch fading as he released her. And for a brief second, she felt the absence of it more sharply than she expected, like the loss of something she had not realized she was holding on to. Elena took a small step back, her breath uneven as relief and unease tangled together in her chest, her eyes flicking once more toward the approaching figures, their outlines now visible between the trees, close enough that she could make out the movement of their shoulders, the direction of their search. When she looked back at him, he had shifted, not retreating, not disappearing, but stepping slightly to the side, positioning himself just beyond where the first glance into the clearing would naturally fall, blending with the shadows in a way that seemed almost intentional, almost practiced. It should have reassured her, should have eased the panic building in her chest, but instead it made her pause, because it was not the action of someone escaping, it was the action of someone choosing where to stand. Her pulse quickened again, confusion threading through her thoughts as she realized he had not truly left, had not taken the chance she had given him. And before she could question it, the first figure broke through the trees. Elena, the voice called out, sharp with surprise, and something else she recognized too well, suspicion. Her body reacted instantly, her shoulders straightening, her hands dropping to her sides as she forced her breathing to steady, her gaze shifting away from where he stood and toward the man stepping into the clearing, as if nothing unusual had happened here, as if she had been alone the entire time. "I am here," she answered, keeping her tone even, controlled, though her heart pounded so loudly she was sure it would give her away. Two more followed behind him, their eyes sweeping the clearing, quickly, assessing, searching, and for a split second she felt the weight of their attention press against her, measuring her presence, questioning it without words. "What are you doing out here?" the first one asked, his gaze narrowing slightly as it lingered on her, taking in the torn edge of her dress, the faint traces of disturbance in the snow around her, details she had not had time to hide. Elena swallowed, forcing herself to hold his gaze without flinching, without looking back, without betraying the truth standing only a few feet away. "I needed air," she said, the answer simple, believable enough if they chose to accept it, though she could feel the tension in the space between them, the quiet calculation as they decided whether her presence made sense. "You should not wander alone during a search," another voice added, more cautious, his eyes scanning the ground again, slower this time, more deliberate. And Elena's chest tightened as she realized how close they were to seeing something they should not. She nodded once, keeping her movements calm, controlled, even as her pulse raced beneath the surface. "I did not know there was a search," she replied, letting just enough confusion edge into her tone to make it sound real, to make them believe she had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. There was a pause, a brief exchange of glances between them, and then the first man exhaled, his posture easing just slightly as he seemed to accept her explanation, or at least decide it was not worth questioning further. "A dangerous animal was seen in this area," he said, his voice firm but no longer sharp. "If you notice anything unusual, you will report it immediately." And Elena nodded again, the words settling heavily in her chest as she felt the truth of them brush dangerously close to the reality she was hiding. "Of course," she answered, her voice steady despite everything. And as they turned to continue their search deeper into the forest, their attention shifting away from her at last, she did not move, did not breathe fully until the sound of their footsteps began to fade, until the clearing felt like hers again, and only then did she allow herself to glance back toward the shadows where he had chosen to remain, the question she had been holding now impossible to ignore, because he had not left, not really, and she needed to understand why. Elena waited until the last echo of footsteps dissolved into the forest before she let her shoulders drop, the tension that had held her rigid finally loosening just enough for her to breathe, though the air still felt tight in her chest, heavy with everything she had not said. For a moment she remained exactly where she was, her eyes fixed on the space between the trees where the search party had disappeared, as if expecting them to return, as if this fragile quiet could break again at any second. But when nothing moved and no voices followed, she turned slowly, her gaze drawn back to the place she knew he had chosen. The shadows seemed ordinary at first glance, the same as they had always been, but now she could feel the difference, a presence that did not belong to the forest itself, something steady and aware waiting just beyond the edge of sight. "You can come out," she said softly, her voice carrying in the stillness without force, without fear, because whatever he was, whatever power he held, he had not used it against her, not when he could have, not when it would have been easier. For a second nothing happened, and she wondered if he had finally taken the chance to leave while her attention had been elsewhere, if she had imagined the certainty of his presence the same way she had almost convinced herself the wolf had not been real. But then the air shifted again, subtle and unmistakable, and he stepped forward from where the light met shadow, exactly where she had expected him to be. Her breath steadied at the sight of him, though her thoughts did not, the questions pressing harder now that the immediate danger had passed, because none of this made sense, not his choices, not his silence, not the way he had stayed when every logical instinct said he should not. "You heard them," she said, her tone quieter now, but no less firm, her eyes searching his face for something she could hold on to, something that would explain why he had risked being seen, why he had remained within reach of the very people searching for him. "They were close enough to see you, and you still did not leave." He did not answer right away, his gaze resting on her with that same steady focus that made it difficult to look away, as if he were measuring something deeper than her words, something beneath the surface she did not fully understand herself. And for a moment she felt that strange awareness again, that sense that he saw more than she intended to show. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, unhurried, carrying none of the urgency she still felt lingering in her chest. "You did not send them toward me," he said, and the simplicity of the statement caught her off guard, her brows drawing together slightly as she processed it, because of course she had not. That had not even been a consideration, not something she had needed to decide. "Why would I?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it, confusion threading through her tone. As she took a small step closer without realizing it, drawn in by the quiet certainty in his voice, something shifted in his expression again, subtle but undeniable, like the confirmation of something he had already believed, and it made her pause, her breath catching slightly as the realization followed close behind. Because he had not stayed out of carelessness. He had stayed because of her, because of the choice she had made, because of what she had not done. The thought settled heavily, unexpected and difficult to ignore, and she shook her head slightly as if to clear it, forcing herself to focus on what mattered. "That does not change the risk," she said, though her voice had softened, without her meaning it to, the sharp edge of urgency replaced by something quieter, something more uncertain. "You cannot assume they will always turn away." He stepped closer then, closing the space between them once more, not in a way that threatened, but in a way that felt deliberate, intentional, and Elena felt her pulse shift again, slower now, but no less intense, as if her body were trying to adjust to a rhythm it did not recognize. "I do not assume," he replied, his voice lower now, steady and certain in a way that made her breath still for just a second. "I decide." And the words settled into the space between them with a weight that made her understand, not fully, not completely, but enough to know that whatever he was, whatever he represented, he was not someone who reacted to the world the way others did. He shaped it, chose his place within it, and somehow, for reasons she could not yet grasp, that choice had led him to remain exactly where she stood. The word decide lingered in Elena's mind longer than it should have, echoing with a weight she could not ignore, because it was not said with arrogance or force. It was said like a fact, like something as certain as the ground beneath her feet, and that certainty unsettled her more than anything else. She studied him for a moment, really looked this time, past the immediate shock, past the lingering fear, and what she saw did not match the danger everyone else would have assumed. There was no panic in him, no urgency, only control, quiet and absolute, like he had never learned how to be anything else. "You speak like nothing can touch you," she said slowly, her voice softer now, but edged with something more thoughtful, more aware, as if she were testing the truth of him instead of reacting to it. His gaze did not shift, did not break from hers, and for a second she wondered if he would dismiss the question entirely. But instead he took another small step closer, closing the last of the distance between them until she could feel the warmth of him in the cold air, subtle but undeniable, and her breath hitched despite herself. "Everything can be touched," he replied, his voice low, steady, but there was something deeper beneath it now, something she could not fully read. "It depends on who is willing to reach for it." And the words settled between them with a quiet intensity that made her chest tighten, because she could not tell if he was speaking about the world around them, or about her. Elena swallowed, her thoughts catching for a moment before she forced herself to focus, to ground herself in what she understood, because whatever he was, whatever he meant, it did not change where she stood in her own world. It did not change the way people saw her, the way they would react if they knew what she had done. "You should not be here," she said again, though the urgency had faded, replaced by something quieter, more conflicted, her gaze dropping briefly before lifting back to his. "Not because of them, but because of me," she added, the admission slipping out before she could stop it, honest in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. He did not interrupt, did not dismiss her words, and that alone made her continue, her voice steady but low. "If they find out I helped you, if they even suspect it, I will not be able to explain it away," she said, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just stating what she knew to be true, what she had lived long enough to understand without needing it spelled out. For a moment, silence stretched again, but this time it felt different, not tense, not uncertain, but focused, like everything had narrowed to just this exchange, just this truth, laid bare between them. Then he moved, not stepping away as she expected, not creating the distance she thought he would finally choose, but reaching up instead, his hand lifting slowly, deliberately, until it hovered just near her face, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from it without the contact itself, and her breath stilled, her body going completely still as she watched him, waiting for something she could not name. "You think this weakens you," he said quietly, his voice softer now, but no less certain. "But it does not." And there was something in the way he said it that made her chest tighten unexpectedly, because no one had ever framed her choices that way. No one had ever looked at her and seen anything other than what she lacked. His hand lowered again before it could touch her, the space between them returning, but not in the same way as before, because now it carried something else, something unspoken but present. Elena exhaled slowly, her heart still unsteady as she tried to process the shift, the way this moment had turned without her understanding how or why. And for the first time since he had appeared, the fear that had driven her began to fade, replaced by something far more complicated, something that made it harder to push him away, harder to pretend this was simple. "Then what do you want?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper, the question honest, direct, because she needed to understand why he was still here, why he had not left when he could have, why he had chosen to stay in a place that offered him nothing but risk. His eyes held hers for a long second, steady and unwavering, and when he answered, there was no hesitation, no doubt, only clarity that settled deep and undeniable. "You already gave it to me," he said, and the quiet certainty in his voice made her breath catch again, because whatever he meant, whatever he had seen in her, it was not something she could easily take back. Elena felt his answer settle into her in a way she could not push aside, the quiet certainty of it lingering far deeper than the words themselves, because whatever he believed she had given him, it was not something she had offered knowingly, not something she understood how to reclaim, and that realization made her chest tighten with a mix of confusion and something far more dangerous, something that felt like it was beginning to shift the ground beneath her. "I do not understand," she admitted, her voice softer now, no longer edged with urgency or resistance, but with something more honest, more uncertain, as she searched his face for clarity that did not come easily. His gaze remained steady, but this time there was something else there, something almost patient, as if he had expected her not to see it yet, as if this moment had always been ahead of her instead of beside her. "You chose without knowing," he said, quietly, each word deliberate. "That matters more than you think." And the simplicity of it should have made it easier to dismiss, easier to argue. But it did not, because deep down she knew he was right about one thing. She had chosen, not because it was safe, not because it made sense, but because she could not walk away. Elena let out a slow breath, her gaze drifting briefly toward the tree line again. The forest now calm, but no less watchful, as if everything that had happened was being held in place by something larger than either of them. "That does not change what happens next," she said, her voice steadying as she grounded herself again in what she knew. In the world she had to return to whether she wanted to or not. "They will keep searching, and eventually they will notice more than they should," she added, her eyes returning to his, firm now despite the uncertainty still lingering beneath the surface. For the first time, he seemed to consider something beyond her, his gaze shifting slightly as if measuring the distance, the time, the pattern of the search that still moved through the forest, and when he looked back at her, there was a subtle shift in his expression, not hesitation, but decision taking shape once more. "Then they will stop," he said, calm and certain in a way that made her breath catch again, because there was no doubt in his voice, no question, only quiet authority. As if what he said would simply become true, Elena shook her head slightly, a small, almost disbelieving motion as she stepped back, needing space to think, to breathe, because that kind of certainty did not exist in her world, not for someone like her, not for someone who had spent her life navigating what others decided for her. "You cannot just decide that," she said, though her voice lacked the strength it might have had before, because part of her had already begun to wonder if maybe he could. His attention returned fully to her, and there was something in the way. He looked at her now, something more direct, more revealing, as if the line between what he was and what she understood was about to shift again. "You asked what I want," he said, his voice lower now, quieter but carrying more weight than before, and Elena felt her pulse quicken instinctively, her body reacting before her thoughts could catch up. "I want you to come with me," he continued, the words simple but impossible all at once, landing between them with a force that made everything else fall away. For a second, she could not respond, her mind catching on the meaning, on the distance implied in those words, on everything she would be leaving behind if she even considered it, and her breath came uneven as she stared at him, searching for something that would tell her he did not mean it the way it sounded. "That is not," she began, her voice faltering before she could finish, because there were too many reasons it was not possible, too many barriers she had never crossed, too many things she did not understand about him, about what he was asking, about what it would mean. He did not interrupt, did not push, simply held her gaze as if giving her space to reach her own conclusion, and that made it harder, not easier, because there was no pressure to resist, no force to push against, only the weight of a choice she had not expected to face. Elena looked away for the first time since he had spoken, her eyes tracing the edge of the clearing, the familiar lines of the forest she had always known, the place that had never truly felt like it belonged to her, but had still been the only place she understood, and the thought of stepping beyond it, into something unknown, into something defined by him, made her chest tighten with both fear and something else she could not name. When she looked back at him, her voice was quieter, steadier despite everything. "And if I say no?" she asked, the question honest, necessary, because she needed to know what kind of choice this really was. His answer came without hesitation, without force, but with a certainty that settled just as deeply as everything else he had said. "Then I will still ask you to stay." And something in the way he said it, not demanding, not commanding, but asking in a way that carried weight far beyond the words, made her realize this was not about control, not about power, but about something far more difficult to refuse. The question hung between them, quiet but impossibly heavy, and Elena felt it settle into her chest like something alive, something that would not fade no matter how long she stood there trying to make sense of it. His answer had not taken anything from her, had not forced her into a corner, and somehow that made it harder to breathe, harder to decide, because this was not about being pushed, it was about being seen, and that was far more dangerous than anything she had faced before. She held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any sign that he would change his mind, that he would turn away if she hesitated long enough. But he did not. He simply stood there, steady and patient, as if time itself had slowed to wait for her. Elena let out a slow breath, her eyes drifting once more toward the edge of the clearing, toward the path that would lead her back, toward the life she knew, the one that had shaped her into someone who stayed quiet, who stayed small, who stayed exactly where she was expected to be. It would be easy to return, easy to pretend none of this had happened, easy to step back into a world that never asked her to choose anything for herself. But the thought did not settle the way it used to. It did not feel safe the way it should have, because now she knew what it felt like to step outside of it, even for a moment. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides as she turned back to him, her heart unsteady but clear in a way she had not felt before. Because whatever this was, whatever he was asking, it was not just about leaving a place. It was about stepping into something unknown, something that might finally see her differently. "You make it sound simple," she said softly, though there was no accusation in her tone, only truth, because nothing about this felt simple to her, not the choice, not the consequences, not the way her world seemed to be shifting around a single moment she had not planned. His expression did not change, but something in his eyes softened just enough to make the space between them feel less uncertain. "It is not simple," he replied quietly. "It is clear," and the distinction settled into her in a way she could not ignore, because for the first time, something in her life felt exactly like that. Not easy, not safe, but clear. Elena swallowed, her gaze dropping for a brief second before lifting again, her decision forming not in a rush, not in fear, but in something steadier, something that felt like it had been building long before this moment. "I cannot go with you," she said, the words leaving her slowly, deliberately, and for a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his reaction. But he did not interrupt, did not pull away, only watched her as if the answer itself was not the end of the question. Elena exhaled softly, her voice continuing before doubt could catch up to her. "Not like this. Not without understanding what I am stepping into," she added, her tone firm now despite the quiet. Because this was not refusal, not entirely. It was something more careful, more honest than that. A faint shift crossed his expression then, something that might have been approval, or recognition, or something deeper that she could not name, and it made her chest tighten again, not with fear this time, but with something that felt dangerously close to trust. He nodded once, slow and certain, as if her answer had not pushed him away but confirmed something instead, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that same steady weight that had drawn her in from the beginning. "Then stay," he said, simple, unwavering. But this time it was not just a request. It was a promise layered beneath the words, something that extended beyond the clearing, beyond the moment, into something she could not yet see. Elena's breath caught slightly as she held his gaze, the meaning of it settling slowly, because he was not asking her to choose everything now, not demanding that she follow without question. He was asking her to remain, to not turn away from what had begun here. The first true light of morning broke through. The trees then, soft and golden, stretching across the clearing and catching in his hair, in his eyes, in a way that made him look both real and unreal at the same time. And Elena felt the moment shift again. Quieter now, but no less powerful. She did not step back this time, did not turn toward the path behind her. Instead, she stood where she was, steady despite the uncertainty still ahead.